to maybe switch off the lights because I have quite a few slides and thought if anyone wants a discreet nap, they could do it now in this session. If that's not too dark for anyone, is that okay? So for me, contemporary poetics is about exploring what's possible with poetry, the poems that we're living, feeling, smelling and seeing. Platforms for poetry are constantly evolving, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about the process of that evolution, more specifically the process involved in comics poetry. My investigation grew out of an interest in visual poetics, New York school poets, and later ekphrastic collections by poets like Ntozake Shange and her Riding the Moon in Texas collection, Shinyu Pei's Equivalents, and Cecilia Vicuna's precarious works. I was also interested in the origins of aesthetics in language, so from Egyptian hieroglyphs to codec fragments, and also Blake's illuminated text, and then later Mallarmé's understanding of the page and all the marks upon it as an image. This work here is from Tom Phillips' treated novel. This here is taken from Jazz Duke's Destiny Wood, some of his concrete poems. Even his typographic experiments, which are three-dimensional sculptures that he creates. And this series by Sandra Huber, in which she created sleep writing rooms, where she dressed up as the princess and went to sleep, and while she was sleeping, poems were fed to her, and the brainwaves that resulted looked like this. Jose Parla's Conversations with Rotella, which is a series of graffiti works, they were also a real influence on me in seeing how these conversations took place outside of the pages. These really poetic conversations that weren't bound by book form. From here, I wanted to look for the platform which consistently combined text and image, comics. And the field of comic scholarship is characterised by the closeness of creators and critics. They're often one and the same. Will Eisner, Scott McCloud, and Gary Sullivan. And for this reason, my research is practice-led, a collaborative process that I'll talk a bit more about towards the end. Comics were continually being compared to prose and film, and I thought, why not poetry? What are the possibilities for comics and poetry? There's some obvious visual comparisons between the size, length, shape and arrangement of stanzas and line breaks in poetry, and the layout and captions of speech balloons, panels and gutters in comics. Even in mainstream comics, like Alan Moore's V for Vendetta, there's overt uses of poetic devices, like the iambic metre of V's speech, which you can see here. So I wanted to examine the ways in which poetry and comics could inform each other, and to explore the potential of such word-image interactions. Scott McCloud, the comics critic, states that the possibilities for comics are endless, so too are attempts to define them. So I'm less interested in defining what comics poetry is than exploring what it can be. The terms comics poetry can be applied to a growing field of works that combine comics and poetic devices. Many of these experiments fall outside of traditional narrative descriptions of the comics medium, and include Dino Buzzati's Poem Strip, Kenneth Cope's Art of the Possible, Warren Craghead's How to Be Everywhere, Matt Madden's comic Sestina, Michael Farrell's Break Me Out, this copy is up the back, as well as works by Bianca Stone, Gary Sullivan, Richard Hahn, Anders Nielsen, and Aaron Franklin. And I'll look more closely at those examples in just a second. Comics poetry differs from concrete poetry and illustrated poems. The idiom refers to comics that consciously employ poetic devices and poems that deliberately experiment with the visual forms of comics, such as panels, gutters, and speech balloons. My analysis of these works is largely underpinned by Rachel Blau du Plessis' theory of poetic segmentivity. She employs the term segmentivity in an attempt to define the components of poetry. According to du Plessis, the underlying characteristic of poetry as a genre is its ability to articulate and make meaning by selecting, deploying, and combining segments. For her, this involves bounded units and the creation of a meaningful sequence by the negotiation of a gap, such as line breaks, stanzas, and page breaks. These bounded units can easily be applied to the fragmented panels, captions, speech balloons, and page breaks within comics. The negotiation of gaps, or gutters as they're known in comics, activates imagination and invites readers to practice what MacLeod terms closure. In other words, the reader bridges the narrative gaps through interpretation and the creation of meaning. Similarly, George Oppen states that to write poetry is to control the sequence of disclosure through segmentation and spacing. In comics, the white space is where narrative is absent is what mobilises readers to make meaning, much the same way as line breaks in stanzas do, in poetry does. Where Duplessis focuses on sequence and line breaks in poetry, I'm more interested in the multiple spaces between word and image, the plane in which meaning is made or imagined isn't a straight one, and it can't always be neatly sequenced into lines. I'd argue rather that comics aren't read up and down or side to side, they're sieved through relative interpretations of space, time, and individual context that can't be wholly contained or conveyed by the page. Poetry and comics accrue meaning simultaneously. In comics, the juxtaposition between word and image is where the poetry is seated, for me. This isn't about the rivalry that a lot of ekphrastic scholarship looks at, the essentialist arguments between word and image. I'm not so interested in those. Comics poetry comprises hybrid textual visual language and works that don't strictly operate as sequential art. The following examples reveal how comics poetry can operate outside of linear narrative frames. This slide is from Dino Buzzati's poem strip, which is a graphic reinterpretation of the myth of Orpheus and his descent into the underworld to rescue Eurydice. Buzzati's poetic explanation of the afterlife is captioned in speech balloons and panels and combined with his own original illustrations. The reimagining of Hades within this work takes the metaphor of an invisible ruler to a different level. This is from Kenneth Coates' The Art of the Possible, in which he explores possibilities for comics and poetry. And the work is subtitled Comics Mainly About Pictures, and that was because while Coates loved comics, he couldn't draw, and this is the result. In the book's introduction, David Lehman states that for Coates, the comic book, no less than the Elizabethan sonnet or romantic ode, has its place in a world of seriousness and can provide the fodder or the structure, the spirit or the form of a poem. The comic book panel was like a line in poetry, a unit of composition, suggesting new ways of talking about things and dividing them up. Coates experiments with segmentation and syntactical division by using comics devices such as handwritten typography, thought bubbles, panels, and speech balloons. Again, in Stained Glass Windows, the sense of simultaneity is heightened by the circular structure of the panels. The poem can begin and end anywhere. This division and organisation of the poem across panels stretches the conventional narrative time and heightens the aesthetic and spatial sense of the words. In The Art of the Possible, simultaneity replaces linear narrative hierarchy in the hand-drawn grids of Brea comics and in Stained Glass Windows. This is my favourite collection of comics poetry, and segmentation and simultaneity are at the core of Warren Craghead's How to Be Everywhere. In this collection, Craghead reworks Apollinaire's manuscripts into 50 new visual poems. He also translated these works, combining structural and syntactical experiments with specific comics devices. On the first page of the collection, a figure, Apollinaire, speaks to the future. His words are contained in a speech balloon, a device repeated throughout the collection. Apollinaire's calligrams directly influence Craghead's typographic experiments, reminding audiences of the semiotic sphere that words and images share when marking meaning on a page. Another comics device employed by Craghead is a repetition of a single object in motion, as in the fall of hats on several pages. The dotted strings between images imply a slow motion framework reminiscent of comics panels and gutters. These lines draw the eye across and down around the page, allowing for multiple non-linear readings. Another comic artist working with the Backward or formalist constraints is Matt Madden. He's a close friend of Craighead's and the creator of 99 Ways to Tell a Story, Exercising Style, which was based on Raymond Queneau's Exercising Style. During a research trip to the States last year, I interviewed him about his process and the use of poetic devices within his comics, in particular the work Six Treasures of the Spiral, a comics festina. He describes this comic as an attempt to equate the lines of the poem with tiers or strips in images. Each page then functions like a stanza of a poem. 6 panels feature a different character from the crew about to set sail on a treasure hunt. The end panel of every line is repeated, changing the order in the same way the final line in a 6-line sestina would. Madden conceived of the spread of panels as units in time. He says that from scene to scene, 6 weeks pass, then 6 days, then 6 hours and 6 minutes. So it heightened this sense of a spiral. And as you get closer and closer, it also mimics the quickening of the whirlpool. He acknowledges Poe's descent into the maelstrom as one of his initial influences for this work. And the final page takes the form of an envoy, drawing all 6 characters into a whirlpool of multiple meanings. He's also experimented with other poetic forms, and this is one called Farmhand Tomb, based on another comic work by Tom Hart. And what's interesting about this one is that the repetition of panels again creates a sense of simultaneity as the characters seem to stutter between past and present events. At the time of interviewing him, he was creating an extended palindrome comic poem. Another artist I interviewed on this research trip is Bianca Stone. She's a New York-based poet and artist, and like poetry refers or makes reference to comics characters such as Charlie Brown, Lois Lane, and Superman. Stone recently launched her website dedicated to poetry comics as well, and she's got quite a comprehensive blog called Who's That Supposed to Be? And her collections include Our Bodies, Ourselves, a book of beasts, and The Secret Intimacies of Insects, as well as her online publications in the form of the Monsieur poem and single frame works. Her chapbook, Someone Else's Wedding Vows, was released last year and contains poems that had previously appeared with visual counterparts in her other collections. Stone's experimentation with poetry in comics grew out of class with Anne Carson on poetry and collaboration at NYU, and she's currently collaborating with Anne Carson on a comics poetry work called Antigone, set for release in 2012. During her undergrad, Stone began to draw images to accompany her poetry and explains how her practice evolved. I began ruthlessly cutting everything. Sometimes a 3-page poem would end up being 3 tiny lines. It was so liberating. I then went through all my old artwork that I never used for anything, all the scraps, which were then placed with poems. These artworks are often developed independently of the poem, and Stone's cut and paste process illustrates the segmentivity and how it informs her process of creation. She says of the practice, the poem was so abstract it allowed my images to go where they wanted. I was surprised at what I drew from the lines in the poem. I love the strangeness of the image and then the poem, the way they seem very separate thematically and yet created another layer of complexity and beauty and sometimes humour to the poem. Stone's complex layering of word and image is also seen in Our Bodies, Ourselves. The comic is informed by a single poem, which also appears as a text-only version in her chapbook. Typography plays a significant role in creating a sense of narration and tone. The text of the poem is handwritten, and all in capital letters, blurring some distinction between traditional line breaks and segmentation. For the remaining part of the presentation, and Adrian, just let me know when I'm coming to I thought I'd just talk about some of the works that I have been, some of the comics poetry collaborations that I've been working on. This slide here is an artist book that Jackie Cavallaro and I created. It's currently being exhibited at Flinders Lane Gallery in Melbourne. And the process for creating this is Jackie responds to poems that I've written from a larger series called Anarchy. And Anarchy, it orbits around these prose-like poems set in the town of Scarlet Hollow. And Scarlet Hollow is an artist slum on the edges of a salt lake, 4 muses, all led by memory, seduced for good and evil. Works from this collaboration have taken the form of artist books, as well as graffiti, live performance, and exhibition pieces. These are just some others. All of them are based on poems that have been written, and they will be turned into the tarot series that we're producing that goes alongside of the comic book. This image is from a recent show with another one of the collaborators in the project, Tamryn Bennett and also Melbourne, and it's called Waking in the Deadwood. As part of this installation, we also created a performance based around the central character, Memory, from the comic. That's a still shot from the performance. And there's a video of Waking in the Deadwood if you're interested. This is a shot from a Gaffer show. Gaffer's a gallery in Sydney, and the artworks from the comic are exhibited there, and as part of that, a small edition of the comic was produced to accompany it. This is from an earlier exhibition, and each time the exhibition focuses on a different character from the comic book as well. And the idea behind it is to explore the three-dimensional lives of those characters, their performance selves as well. Another extract from the book that accompanied the show, graffiti pieces unnamed that also are based around the Muse story. And this is some of the ways that the poem in earlier versions was looking at taking comics devices and layering them with original works. This is from Obsession Possession, a book which Guillermo Bantis put together, and as you can see, some of the segmentation of the text pieces is also what informs the comics structure that is also used in some of the Anarchy pieces, other stills from installations. So hopefully the works that I've been discussing, it's by no means an exhaustive list of comics poetry, but hopefully they demonstrate some of the ways poetic devices are being used to experiment and extend the hybrid visual language of both comics and poetry. The reason for creating some of these shows as well, connected to the idea of segmentivity, is to further explore non-linear structures for poetry. Poetry existed before the printing press and is not bound to the page. What's possible with poetry is the poems that we're living. Thanks.